What is this new white order that stepped foot on the scene in the 1600s? It's a social and political system based on whiteness, which upholds a set of beliefs and ideas about whiteness that was carefully constructed to promote destruction and domination of all the people that fall outside of that group. And so how did this new white order become established? Through the legal system, which was controlled by men who had the knowledge and the understanding to turn the idea of whiteness into a fully functioning entity on the earth plane. And this is what we're going to talk about right now in this video. And so for us to do that, we're going to read from this book right here called Birth of a White Nation by Dr. Jaqueline Battalora. So let's go in here and turn to page 44, where she writes this. Post-rebellion laws in Virginia produced consequences that rendered one group of people privileged and the other groups of people, i.e. Negroes, mulattoes, and Indians, disadvantaged. Post-rebellion is referring to Bacon's rebellion, which was in 1676. So after this rebellion, the Virginia colonial powers, they began passing laws which made very clear distinctions between the different members in the society. And the groups that they labeled as Negroes, mulattoes, and Indians were to be the disadvantaged groups. Let's keep going. These laws worked to create a fault line between laborers that did not previously exist. These enactments worked to make white people real by shaping a range of shared experience and expectations that came to constitute white culture. And so they figured out how to use the laws to infiltrate the thought patterns of the people in the society. They carved out certain members to be labeled as white, which through legal enactments began to highly influence the meaning and the value of being white, which reshaped the thinking of the members in that society. And with this new white consciousness finding expression in the human vehicle, it began to create white culture. And culture is a product of beliefs and ideas within a group of people, which influence how those people interact in the world. Let's keep reading. The colonial elite had little in common with the European bond laborers who worked for them. With the invention of white people, these two groups now shared an authority over Native Americans and those of African descent, built on the idea that they shared a superior status, that of whiteness. And superiority is a large part of white consciousness. It started out that way and it still continues that way for many people who identify as white. But it's an idea first and foremost, and that idea assumes as the default that white is naturally superior to all non-white, meaning just by being born with the label white, without any accomplishments or having done anything at all, it wants to create as the default assumption that this whiteness is superior, right? And this ideology has been built over many, many centuries and repeatedly conditioned in most members of the society. And so the continued belief in this ideology is what keeps it living in the minds of people today. And so this ideology began back in the 1600s, where the elite found a way to influence the European laboring class to share this sense of superiority against the natives and those of African descent. Now let's keep reading. In other words, whiteness reconstituted prevailing class hierarchy. The invention of white people resulted in a new tier of labor, poor whites. This group came to see themselves as more like the plantation elites than the African bodies over whom they now helped rule. And the poor Europeans were the ones they really needed to neutralize, because they were the ones involved with the Negroes in revolts and rebellions, like in the case of Bacon's rebellion. And so the elite, with all that time on their hands to think and imagine, and with all that power that they had to control the law, they figured out exactly what they needed to do to neutralize these people, which was to give them a little bit of power over the slaves, which from the elite perspective was a really good division strategy, right? As we can see how things unfolded later on. But let's keep reading. Plantation life was reorganized to reflect the different treatment between white and non-white people that the new laws imposed. Poor whites emerged as the managers over those of African descent, and served as the wedge that kept them from seeing that their condition was more similar to that of Africans and Native Americans than to the elite of the colony. And so they had become pawns in the elite's game of domination, and they didn't understand how they were being used, and they probably didn't care that much either, just as long as they had someone to feel superior to. Let's keep going. To maintain their political status after Bacon's rebellion, the ruling elite led wars against Native Americans instead of opposing them, as they had done when Nathaniel Bacon advocated for violence against Native Americans. According to Alan Taylor, such wars united the free whites by providing convenient external, alien scapegoats for internal frustrations and inequalities, and by providing farms for the next generation of common planters. And so it appears that these wars were avenues for some of these free whites to vent off their frustration on other peoples. And these wars that the elite were promoting also enabled some of these poor whites to gain access to land. Let's keep reading. After 1704, free white men were promised 50 acres of land upon completion of their term of service, a policy that ensured government would continue to take more and more Native American land into the foreseeable future. Through the package of laws passed by Virginia lawmakers following Bacon's rebellion, colonial lawmakers worked to invent white people and constituted not just rules that constructed a boundary between social order and criminality, but also the rules of whiteness. And so this is going into the shaping of white consciousness to influence people to become aware and to believe in certain ideas. And then once those ideas are firmly established within those individuals' minds, then specific actions follow as a necessary consequence of those beliefs. So these laws were put in place to put certain limitations around the thinking patterns of the society and basically herding them into believing and acting in certain ways. Here we go. These enactments shaped ideology and social structure and helped to explain the staying power of the invention called white people. The term ideology references a set of ideas about reality, and every one of us has a set of ideas about reality. And these ideas set the framework for how we interpret and interact in the real physical world. And since most people have never had any clue about how this works and the elite have always known, they were able to create environments that highly influence the way that people formulate these ideas in their mind about reality. And they were doing it in such a way that the subjects actually believe that it was their own ideas that they have accepted instead of someone else's, right? That's how they were using the law to mold the ideologies within those humans. Let's keep reading. It refers, talking about the ideology, to the promulgation of ideas that support actions and expectations. That's the spreading of ideas like seeds in the garden of your mind and watching them grow into real life actions. Here we go. The laws enacted from 1681 through 1723 worked to justify the legitimacy of African bondage and to further the exploitation of Native Americans by promoting the view of white people as essentially free, pure, rightful owners of land and deserving of rights and privileges others could be denied. You see how that works? These laws set the framework, and they were rigged in such a way to encourage the belief in white superiority over everyone else. And eventually people began to accept these laws as the norm within that society, which produced certain psychological and behavioral responses. And understand that this could have been done by any group of people to any other group of people at any other time if they had these ideas and the power to implement them. And so, for example, people could make laws today saying that no whites are allowed to shop within the city limits. They can't own any land, they can't own any real estate, and they cannot attend any top-rated schools. And in time, this would create a massive shift in public perception about whites to where white people would begin to be looked at as the new lower class. Now, I'm not promoting any such ideas or anything close to this because this is absolute foolishness. This is what they were doing, right? I'm just giving you an example on how this tool could be used to create massive changes, right? And this is how they used it to justify white superiority and the blacks continuing as perpetual slaves. Here we go. The law directed all white people to see themselves as a unified group through the value placed on them and authority given to them. Taken as a whole, these laws instructed people to see whites as more important as valued. In this way, the social supremacy of white people became a fulfilled prophecy for the group. In addition, the laws directed white people to be in a position of authority over those of African or Native American descent. This message of white authority, in turn, shaped perceptions of self, group, and others. meaning it changed the way that people saw themselves in relation to other people. If the Negro became used to seeing whites as the only authority figure, then what type of understanding about themselves and about the whites do you think they would have developed? And in contrast, because there's always a contrast, with the whites becoming accustomed to having this authority over the blacks and the natives, what type of understanding about themselves and about the blacks and the natives do you think that they would have developed? Think about that. Let's keep going. It would be virtually impossible for white people to escape at least some level of internalization of the idea that they were better than those seen as not white. You see that? If they were being continuously marketed the idea of white superiority, and then on top of that, they only witnessed the act of whites ruling over blacks and Native Americans, then it must have been almost impossible for them to escape the getting high off of the feeling of superiority. Now here we go. Conversely, it would be equally as unlikely that one could fully escape internalizing the message of inferiority, because inferiority and superiority are linked together as pairs of opposites. You cannot have the superiority without the inferiority, or else it doesn't make any sense. They're just equal, right? You need to have this separation here to have a superiority to look at an inferiority. And inferiority is what the Negro came to comprehend most. And like Dr. E. Franklin Frazier said, they came to believe in their own inferiority. Now let's keep reading. The notion of purity that attached to white people included an understanding of whiteness as representative of spiritual purity within a Christian context. Christian symbolism of light and dark, representing good and evil, was readily applied to bodies. And who was the dark applied to? The Negro. The colonists claimed that the Negroes were black and had dark skin, which created an unconscious association to concepts like bad, evil, and the devil, right, from below. And the Europeans, on the other hand, were called white, and they were said to have light skin, which unconsciously associated them with concepts like good, angel, and God, right? And these concepts and descriptions of people have drastic underlying effects on the psyche and the self-esteem of people. And the people attributing these labels to these people clearly understood that. Understand. Now let's get some more. Christian notions of spiritual purity provided a psychological and socio-political resource to shape a moral Christian foundation for a hierarchy of humanity that placed white people at the top. And we know the blacks are going down to the bottom. It's perfect basic symbolism, which is why it works so well. Here we go. Through these laws and with the aid of religious, economic, and psychological resources, the idea of white people as a superior group could flourish. If enforcement of the laws passed after Bacon's Rebellion was not enough to impress upon colonists the idea that white people are an identifiable group who are essentially different from, in fact superior to, those excluded from the category, then propagandizing efforts imposed by Virginia lawmakers served to clarify. Each spring and each fall, parish clerks or church wardens were required to read the law in full at the conclusion of Sunday service, while sheriffs were required to do so as well at the courthouse door. The laws resulted in a complete restructuring of colonial society. The message that white people are superior and ought to be in a position of authority relative to all others reinforced this restructuring and rendered it common sense. Ideology alone does not have the staying power that the category white has exhibited some 300 years. Ideology alone was not the only result of the post-Bacon's Rebellion enactments in Virginia. The laws also constituted social structure, patterned social arrangements that impacted individual actions. For those who became white, the classification became valuable for the material, psychological, and spiritual privileges it conferred. And if it became valuable for those who became white, then what did it become for those who were labeled as black? You already know. Here we go. Cheryl Harris explains that by according whiteness an actual legal status, an aspect of identity was converted into an external object of property, moving whiteness from privileged identity to a vested interest. Whiteness became a form of property with a material value that those who held the label could deploy for their benefit. The value and privilege conferred on white people contrasted with the denial of human worth and community privilege for those excluded from it. You see that? It contrasted with those who were excluded. And this contrast, especially if it's a significant contrast, this is what creates the effect. If it's a little small baby contrast, not that much of an effect. But if it's an extreme contrast, then the effects are perceived and experienced to a much greater extent, right? Let's keep reading. The invention of white people transformed society by dividing laborers who were previously united. Colonial society was reshuffled through these laws to create an entirely new tier of laborers, poor whites, and an entirely new bottom to the social hierarchy, assigned to both enslaved and free persons of African descent and to Native American people, with the Negro going furthest down into the pit. The Native Americans, they went down far into the pit too, but the Negro went world record depths down into the dungeon. Let's keep reading. This new arrangement shaped the actions of the laborers in ways that differed sharply from interactions prior to and during Bacon's Rebellion. Those of African descent were rendered passive and submissive to the actions of white people. White laborers were made managers and rulers of all those viewed as not white. The laws that followed Bacon's Rebellion drove a wedge between laborers by creating different consequences depending on one's categorization. These different consequences impacted everyday life in profound ways. Racial formation is a sociological theory for examining race as a socially constructed identity shaped by social, economic, and political forces. And what is meant by socially constructed? That means ideas and beliefs that are created and upheld by the society, as opposed to something that's derived purely from nature. And the vast portion of the reality that you experience is socially constructed. You have a program running in your mind right now that's based primarily on the values, the ideas, the beliefs, and the standards of the society that you live in. And it's influencing how you think, how you dress, what you listen to, how you identify, right? And it can be very difficult to break out of this program because of the human herd mentality that wants to follow and fit in, right? And these people, they understood that. And so they put in a mass amount of effort to shape the racial ideology, knowing that once it was established that people would be stuck with that program for a very long time. Now let's keep going. The bundle of laws, the meanings they promulgated, and the social structure they constituted represented a race-making project. That's the program they were instructing to be installed in the minds of the people. The white man, the Indian, and the Negro 3.0. That was the program. Let's keep reading. The laws simultaneously represent, interpret, and explain an unequal and unfair distribution of resources, such as claims to and denial of due process and self-defense, possession of a gun, the exercise of political voice in an election, along dividing lines of humanity, white on the one hand and Negro, mulatto, and Indian on the other hand, that work to create, perpetuate, and institutionalize representations of bodies made different. These differences laid the groundwork for social construction of race, which was the program they released into that society, and they put maximum effort into conditioning people to accept it. And that program was that whites were to be looked at as superior and everyone else inferior. And many people still have this program running in the background of their mind today. And these videos are to help people understand that program and eventually remove it from their mind and replace it with something else. Let's continue. As such, the decades after Bacon's Rebellion represented not only the creation of white people, but also the groundwork for race in North America. Who was white was by no means clearly established in the decades following Bacon's Rebellion and remains undefined as a matter of law to this day. In this way, the label white held the potential to be crafted and contoured by those who held legislative or judicial power, providing them with the ability to include and exclude. An understanding of whiteness as ideology and social structure allows for an important distinction to be made. While white people refers to those categorized as such, whiteness refers to much more. It is meant to capture the ideological underpinning that sustains the group, structural advantages that position white people above all others, and the viewpoints on the part of white people that these structures work to shape. English and European colonists did not experience a genetic transformation in the decades following Bacon's Rebellion that turned them from Irish, Dutch, or English into whites. The differences between persons of European and African descent did not emerge from their biological condition, but rather through social enactments that demanded they be treated differently. Just as these beneficiaries produced racist ideas about black people, in the enactments that followed Bacon's Rebellion, the ruling elite produced supremacist ideas about white people being suited for or deserving of domination relative to African and indigenous people. This history reveals the role of law in inventing a human grouping, assigning it meaning as superior, and organizing a society based on both. The historical record of the emergence of those called white people in law reveals that the category was not inevitable and was not the result of nature. White people are the result of tremendous human effort, including writing and enacting laws, a regular reading of these laws at church on Sunday and from the courthouse steps, and strict enforcement of a completely reorganized society. In other words, white people are a social construct. And to be realistic, every group is a social construct, because people are not born as black people, white people, Japanese people, Chinese people, or any of these labels. These are identities that children are conditioned to accept. And this is how it has always been throughout civilization. But how Europeans changed the game is that they came along with their power and resources, and they constructed identities and molded the consciousness of various groups of people, right? Things that these people didn't do on their own. And so they constructed a society where all non-whites were to be looked at as inferior, while the whites were to be understood and believed internally by everyone that they were superior. And so this was part of the new white order, which reared itself up for the purpose of world domination. But today it's a different story, and that order is no longer as strong as it once was. That ideology is losing steam rapidly as people from all backgrounds resurrect from the grave and reprogram their thoughts and their perceptions. But it's still a strong force, and that's something that we have to understand. And it's a quite interesting entity that has manifested on the world stage. And so hopefully this video has given you some insight and has helped you somewhat get some extra light to find your way on the path, and to use that light to help you reprogram your own mind. And so I want to thank you for watching all the way into the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.